And again, want to extend a warm welcome to those who are new or newer. As was mentioned, we're continuing in an extended series or focus on encountering Jesus through the Gospel of Luke. Because this Gospel account that Luke gives us as part of the Scriptures is really an account of a living testimony, for Christ is risen, and his life and all that he said and did is itself alive and at work in a way and continues to speak to us. And as we come into this fall season, we reach a point in the 12th chapter of this gospel, as we set it apart, to see Jesus engaging us in some of the largest questions of life, the kind of questions that define life. And you can feel the intensity of Jesus wanting his followers and all of human life to understand that in many ways we are just really disoriented about the way life really is, who we really are. And that he has no interest in us having some moralistic religion where he just tries to make us slightly more moral beings. He sees us as absolutely disoriented. He wants us to understand who we are, what direction we are. Because if you're disoriented in your sense of where you are in relationship to reality, then you won't be able to do well. You won't even know where you're going. I found this out at a young age when I joined a basketball team, and it was a little YMCA team. I'm probably 7, 8 years old, and maybe even younger. And it was a little intimidating, your first little basketball team, and like it's time you're going to have to get thrown into a game at some point. You're nervous about that, but it was extra so because we had one of those kids that already has emerged as one of the real cool athletes, the ones everybody's going to be intimidated by. David Saunders, he went on to play, as we grew up, in the U.S. Olympic team that won our first gold medal for the Olympics, and he was the star of the team. I did not. And so that gives you an idea. When you have one of those kids on the team, you feel extra nervous. Anyways, time comes, first chance. Coach says, go in. Jump into the game. I'm thrown into the game in the middle of it, and the ball comes free. And I'm just like, oh my, the ball comes free to my hands. This is an amazing moment. And I take it, I dribble it down, and I make a layup. And I'm turning around with all of oh my gosh, they're all this is my coolest moment. Turn around, and they were not excited because I had gone the wrong direction and just scored a basket for the other team. And that's a true story. And I would suggest to you that in far more serious matters, Jesus says, you and I are deeply disoriented about any sense of where we're going. And we too can find ourselves at the end thinking we've done well and realizing we had the whole direction wrong. And we will regret it. And it's that kind of intensity by which he comes. He sees the whole of our lives struggling with this. And so I invite you to listen to what he has to say in this particular moment. Follow with me and pick me up in chapter 12, verse 13. First 3 verses here. We get introduced to the situation. He's been teaching about how to have your life centered in the priority in God. And then it says, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, all of them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possession." So in this moment, Jesus is teaching about important things, and a man interrupts him and saying essentially, hey, I got this family problem going on. We've got to work out this division of an inheritance. My brother's in control of it. It's not really working my way. Will you work that out? And that you can hear something kind of strange and rude. Everybody's looking to him as the one who may be the promised Savior of the world, and you want to work out your family inheritance. Now, it's not completely unusual for a rabbi to be asked to partake in something like that, but Jesus makes it clear this is not merely a legal rendering that you need. There's a spiritual rendering behind this. There's something deeper than merely working this out. The man doesn't even seem to imply that he's working towards fairness. You don't hear the man saying, hey, my family's going to get divided, and I don't want that to happen, because we all know that dividing up an inheritance is still to this day one of the most sensitive things that takes place, and some families become deeply divided and torn asunder by it. But this man doesn't seem to say that that's his concern. He doesn't say anything about, help me work out what's fair. He seems to be saying, let me get my stuff. And he's driven by it. And so Jesus responds to him and says, I need to address the deeper underlying problem that's at hand, and it's greed. And in fact, it's very clear because he speaks of the greed, not as your greed in the singular, but he shifts to the plural. You and your brother, and perhaps all of us, we all have this dynamic of greed at hand. And this, Jesus introduces us to this term greed. Some translations will use the word covetousness, but it's very similar. It's very much speaking to the same type of dynamic that Jesus is getting at. We could describe greed as this driving desire to get more, to take more, more than we need. Or as someone said, greed is the lust to have more than one's fair share, more than we need, which is never fully satisfied. It's a drive, a lust that will never kind of reach what it is that we're trying to get. Always more than we need, always more than is fair. It's just that kind of consuming nature. And greed, I think, is one of those things that, like last week when we addressed hypocrisy that Jesus raised up, that when we hear greed, we're like, oh, good, yeah, I so hate people who are greedy. And we always think those who have more than us are somehow the ones we can look at and say, they're greedy, they're too rich. It's always easy to cast it out, and Jesus has no desire for that to be the way that we deal with this. He's addressing something in all of us, something that can take over, whether you have a lot, and that brings challenges, or you have little, and that brings challenges. This lust for somehow getting a hold of more that drives us and defines us. And it becomes clear that Jesus sees this as an issue of what defines us. Because he goes and immediately, as he uses the word greed, he speaks about and confronts the fundamental underlying belief that he's really contending with. And it's what? One's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Jesus is saying in these words, the problem underlying it that we all can face is that we think our lives do consist of, our existence is defined by what we get a hold of in this world. I believe most of us in this room would say, that's exactly what I don't believe. I don't believe that. I don't want to believe that. And yet I say that almost every one of our lives struggles with that. We all want to say, I'm not greedy, I'm not materialistic, I don't associate with my material possessions. I don't know anyone who doesn't at times. Who doesn't somehow reach for something and try to feel better by what we have, wouldn't sense that they would be better off or more successful if they succeeded in a material wealth and possessions. This is the struggle. Jesus says, one's life, that means you, and this other thing called possessions, out here, material possessions and wealth, he says, your life is not defined by your relationship to those. It's not. And he wants us to be liberated from this sense that I am only validated or good or worthwhile or successful depending on how much I can accumulate, what abundance I can have. You're not merely an accumulator of other stuff. And he wants us to get that. He wants us to be free from that idea. And so he continues in verse 16 with a story to help bring this home. A parable, if you will. We often refer to it as the parable of the rich fool. But pick up with me in verse 15, where he gives this picture of life rooted in that belief. He told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger barns. and there I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for themselves, but is not rich to God. Now we can see this man being called out as a fool. And we can want to think of them merely as a bad person and a fool and what have you. But it's very important to think what Jesus didn't say about him. Very clearly, he did not describe this man as some kind of shady crook. He didn't say this man is a fraud. This man is a man who took things from other people. This is a man who had disregard for other people. Nowhere. None of those types of things are associated with this man. In fact, what are we told about this man? He was a farmer. Really legitimate, and very honorable way of life. Does any farmer ever succeed without working hard? No. He is a hard-working farmer. And it's got to be very clear to us that Jesus is not in any way, nor do the scriptures ever, speak negatively about somebody who's produced great wealth. That's not what this is about. He doesn't deride him for his material success. He is going to challenge his relationship to that and how it leads out and works out in very foolish ways if we don't have a healthy relationship with material possessions. And this is what he begins to engage, and this is what he raises up. And in the story, we begin to see something of the anatomy of greed, or the controlling pathway that greed takes as these certain views of things or beliefs begin to take control of us. So let me mention these quickly. And the first is this. What we see here in this story is that we become identified with what we have, attached and entitled to the gifts of life as if we were their very source. This is what Jesus has so central. He wants you and I free from becoming overly attached to seeing ourselves in relationship, so that other stuff does not decide whether we are good, bad, or otherwise. He doesn't want us that attached. And it's very clear in this story. Jesus makes it very clear. He describes the way things really are. Where did the man's material wealth come from? Does Jesus say? Yes, he does. He says, the ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. Did the rich man produce it? No. The ground of a certain... The material resources of the Creator is what we manage. That's what you and I work with. We just work with what the owner's materials are. We are merely the ones who manage and bring it to fruition. But what does the man, how does he refer to all of these things? We read how he speaks of my crop, my barn, my grain, my goods. Here you see this idea of mine. He becomes so over-identified with it. It's that sense of this is the stuff, and I got to get the most stuff. You can hear it with little kids, right? The little infant, he goes, mine, and they begin to like, oh my gosh, where does this evil come from? But somehow it's like this very nature of even the smallest infant that begins to grab and shout, mine, because mine is the very dynamic, this idea of absolute ownership that we have. It begins to take control of us as we begin to what? Feel that my existence is rooted in what I have. And if it is, hey, you better grab for all the mine you can get. But Jesus is saying it's not. It is not ultimately who you are. And he wants us to be free from this, the power of this. If I was to ask any of us, hey, does anyone want to come up here and show how they produce wealth out of nothing? Anybody? No, because none of us could. None of us could come up here and produce wealth out of nothing. Everything we produce, as the scriptures tell us, is because God gave us a means to it. It all ultimately comes from him. That is the beautiful mandate that God gave to humanity. take the material, take the stuff, manage creation, God's creation, and be fruitful and what? Multiply. Create life. Create what is life-giving. Bring forward all the good fruit that can serve everybody else. That's an incredible mandate. That's what he wants from us. And that is why God always honors work and never honors wealth. Nowhere does he honor someone because of their wealth. He always, though, honors people by their work, their integrity, their care for others, their compassion, the way that they bring forth fruitfulness in life. That is a good thing, but never merely what you get at. And that's what he's bringing back. And secondly, we see that greed's controlling path will do this, that we trade the present contentment for the vanity of a bigger future. You see this point in which we think, well, when the man gets rich, then he begins to have a problem. He begins to start thinking about more and more about that. He's always waiting to get rich. But actually, did the man get rich when he had this bumper crop, this great season, and then he got rich? How did Jesus start identifying him from the very beginning? He already said he was rich before any of this happened. He said a rich man, that's what he is already, had this great season in which he just expanded more and more. The point is, this man kept thinking, always ahead. One day I'll have enough. But he actually was already wealthy. And I think this hints at and suggests that we all can have a problem in which we lose or we surrender our sense of just contentment in the present because we become so focused on something in the future. And this is a challenge many of us feel. We often come around the season of Thanksgiving looking at this type of thing because we all feel like, okay, there's this week, I'm supposed to stop and count my blessings, and then this thing called Black Friday starts like 1 hour that's all about telling me what I don't have right after I'm trying to count my blessings. The truth is, we laugh. Every single thing in this life is telling you that you don't have enough. Everything. Everything is defined. Somebody else needs to make money by you being discontent. You understand that, right? So everything is invested on you never being thankful for what you already have. If you are, everybody else that's trying to make money from you is screwed. Am I wrong? So we are really pressed that the most thing you can pretty much is you'll never be happy. You'll never appreciate what you have. You'll always think that you're poor. You'll always be thinking that there's this thing out there that's going to help fix it. Someone said this, greed starts with discontentment, the enemy within that forges its change. Discontentment tells us that happiness will not occur until the next purchase, the next possession, the next upgrade. Ooh, upgrade. First service, I said, my kids, nobody's ever been satisfied with the iPhone version that they have. And my wife said, oh, you mean the kids? I said, no, I mean no one in my family is ever satisfied. There's just something. And if you said, well, what is it? Oh, man, this one. And you kind of like, wow, have we lost perspective. That little thing in your hand, it's pretty much doing more than anybody could have ever conceived. But, come on. There's a new version. And the new version suddenly makes us discontent. That's life. We laugh at it, but actually our whole life is always thinking that there's something more. We never can enjoy what we have, really. As soon as there's a new version. And life will always have something more. Always. So therefore, we are guaranteed to never be happy. This is what we see in this man. There's always the sense of losing his own sense of what he already has. And that is something that is we've got to so deeply try to overcome. And this leads thirdly to another point that I think we see twisted in Jesus' story. We become focused upon ourselves, reduced to consumers rather than producers. We see this man saying, I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take care, take it easy, just enjoy them. What's he focused on? Him, self and nothing more. And the grand mandate for you and I to be those who are fruitful and help the world and bring forth its fruitfulness, an amazing way in which you are connected to a larger reality, is completely lost because you're reduced to just consuming for yourself. That's what happens with greed. We not only are selfish, there's a problem of smallness. We become smaller. Your identity as a producer who flourishes is always an identity that makes you part of a bigger world. Your identity as a consumer who just consumes for your own good end is going to always make you smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Your world will just eventually just become lost in self-consumption. We become nothing. And every time that we're out there and we feel down about ourselves and when we feel down, some of us know, what do? We go shopping. I need to go shopping. I need to go look for something that might make me feel more alive or bigger. It never ends that way. So we go out and we go window shopping. Now, anybody who's like under 50 probably doesn't know what window shopping is. There used to be a day when the only stores out there were windows, and now window shopping is even easier. It's a window on your browser. And you just hit Amazon.com, and you can go shopping all the time. You feel a little low, and you go window shopping. And Joel and I will always joke, like we're buying lawnmowers when we don't even have lawns. Like we just go out, and you just finally divert into something, but maybe, why? In the end of the day, we're going to try to buy something to make ourselves feel better because we somehow feel less. And it never, ever works. It never does. We become smaller when we become more self-consumed. And that's the tragedy. It's an inward spiral, and it doesn't really work well. And this is what Jesus is trying to get us out of saying. Jesus lived as one who was profoundly satisfied with his life. He worked as a carpenter. He worked in different ways, and so did others. But they had their lives as part of a bigger story than merely consumption of material goods. They were a part of something bigger. So they're excited. They're waking up every morning to being part of a bigger story, not into accumulating material wealth. And that's what he wants for us. He wants us to come into that place. And we see in this man, we wonder, did this man himself become, as he became more isolated, it almost sounds like he's talking to himself. Who else is he talking to in the story? Sounds like no one. He's just talking to himself, and the truth is, many people, as they pursue material wealth, will find that their lives are becoming more and more isolated. They become the Howard Hughes who dies alone with nobody in their lives because they haven't been able to live in relationship to a bigger world but to themselves. Jesus wants to defy that. Fourthly, we see that another part of this process is that we lose life's natural humility as we presume more control over the future than we actually have. Notice in verse 18 he says, then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns, build bigger barns, and then I'll store my grain. All of this is good. Hey, it's good for planning. Nothing wrong with planning. But he's so set that he's going to be able to traverse life. He's got it all planned out. And while plans are good, without humility, we're going to find ourselves deeply frustrated by life because we're not in control of all the circumstances of our future. Anybody here ever found that life took a turn that you weren't expecting, wasn't in your plans? What do you do with that? You either freak out because somehow you thought you were in control, or you learn the humility that says, I am not the sovereign over everything. And that deeply affects us financially because if we're like, I've got my life planned out, and I've got all my financial success planned out, and then something doesn't work, we are completely lost. Because we've so attached ourselves to it, we don't know how to be independent of that sense and presumption of control. If we realize, I am just going to make plans, if they don't work out that way, the real me will not have changed. I will not be lost if those plans don't work out. Now, this man had plans he was so certain of, and there is where Jesus is trying to help us see. He's mistaken. It's not going to work out the way he planned, and we all do well to hear that. James, one of the writers of the scriptures and Jesus' brother, wrote this, And it's great wisdom for all of us, and it speaks directly to someone like this man or ourselves when we lose that humility. In James chapter 4 of the scriptures, it says, some of you say, today or tomorrow we're going to go to some city. We'll stay there a year, do business, and make money. But you do not know what will happen tomorrow. Your life is like a mist. You can see it for a short time, but then it goes away. So you should say, if the Lord wants, we will live and do this or that. But now you're proud and you brag. All of this bragging is wrong. What he's trying to get at is saying planning is good. There's nothing wrong. God always honors us to be good at making plans. But don't lose the humility that you are not defined by being able to be in control. You're not. Planning is one thing. Humility says, keep your plans in the looseness of God's control. You're not God. And so if things take a turn, they take a turn. If you're greedy and you've got all your plans and you're controlling everything, you are going to be deeply frustrated. You're going to be at a tragic loss at some point in your life when it doesn't play out that way, when the stock market changes, when the value of something changes, when you lose your job, when you face some kind of expense you weren't planning. Any of that can destroy the person who's presuming too much control. And finally, number 5, we find that we have treasured what will not last at the expense of what will. This is where Jesus brings the story home in the last 2 verses. But God said to this man, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God. What Jesus is getting at when he says, your life is demanded of you. He uses the term here that means when you call in a loan. At some point, God's going to call in the loan. What is the loan? Your life. It was loaned to you. And when God calls that loan and says, hey, our relationship, how is it? Oh, well, my relationships with material goods, I just accumulated a lot of them. Oh, then you'll have nothing because it's over and you won't be able to enjoy those. What you should have invested into is our relationship. Be rich towards God because that is the essence of who you are. That's what Jesus lived out, was that reality. As I said, Jesus lived for, it said, the joy that was set before him, and it was the joy of doing the Father's will. Jesus said that over and over. What did he say to his disciples? I just do what I see my Father do. I do my Father's will. No. He said even more. I find pleasure in doing my Father's will. I want my joy, the joy that I have in doing my Father's will, to be your joy. That's what I'm trying to get you to have. I want you to have this insane joy that just transforms your life. It's the joy of coming home as prodigals who grabbed all the stuff, tried to do our own life, found out the world will just exploit us, who come back to the Father. That's the story of the prodigal. Come back to the house, find that all of our dignity is restored, and there's joy. There's a party going on. Jesus wants us living in that joy. Jesus wants us understanding why he lives for hearing those words, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into my Father's joy, my Father's house. That's what he wants for us. But if we say, no, I have an alternative. I want to live for what this table will do for me. Jesus is saying nothing wrong with the table. In fact, it's good. He was a carpenter. He probably built some tables. He valued them. You get that? There's nothing wrong with the table. But if you think you consist of the table, and if you don't have a relationship with God, you don't understand yourself as a spiritual being, but merely material, this table is all you got. And in the end, it'll be all you are. You will go from material to material. That's it. He doesn't want that. He wants you to know who you really are. So he says, be rich towards God. Invest your life in the good things that God is doing. Amen? Let's stand together and let's pray. Would you pray with me as we stand? And I want to invite you in your heart just to join me in a minute where I want to really encourage us to hear the deep sense that Jesus is here to liberate us. He wants to bring freedom, not from some evil greed among the greedy out there, but among the power of greed that will keep trying to become almost a lust in us that we all know is generally at work. Some of us more than others. Some of us know we're very given to trying to find well-being or peace or soothing ourselves with things. But all of us some. And I just invite us to just give God a moment to remind us we are not merely material beings. And to hear that behind all this lies a mandate for us to become bigger, to be those who embrace the call to let the world flourish with generosity. And so he invites us into that which we can bring forth his will and his work in this world, his compassion. Jesus, we invite you to help break the power of oppression that sometimes we have, because we really do sometimes think that we consist of our material goods. We consist of the fact that you created us and called us your daughters and sons. That is our essence, we pray, Jesus, and we pray that we would be faithful to following you in that knowledge and that way of life. Let's respond and worship together.